My dad smirked. "You think this company runs on computers?" And handed control to my cousin. I left without arguing, then watched the business collapse within months until bankruptcy was filed because the only person keeping it alive had finally walked away. I knew my dad was angry with me before he even finished the sentence. It started with a Monday morning meeting that was supposed to be about payroll and inventory. Instead, it became the moment I realized I had spent almost 12 years holding together a company my family had quietly decided belonged to somebody else. The business was a regional wholesale supplier that my grandfather had started decades earlier, mostly selling maintenance parts and commercial equipment to contractors, small manufacturers, school districts, and property management companies. We were not a huge company. There were 38 employees when things were good, a warehouse, a small office, 3 delivery vans, and a customer list that had been built over a very long time. The company made money in a boring way. Customers ordered things they needed. We found the inventory, got it out the door, invoiced them, collected the money, paid our vendors, and did the same thing again the next day. There was no glamorous technology involved. There was also no magic. There were just thousands of small decisions made correctly. I had learned that because I had spent years making them. My dad had founded the company with my grandfather after working there as a teenager. By the time I joined full-time, my grandfather was mostly retired, and my dad was technically the president. My cousin, Derek, worked in sales. I was hired to modernize our internal operations because we were still using spreadsheets, paper invoices, handwritten inventory adjustments, and a software system that crashed whenever someone tried to run a report with too many filters. At first, my dad thought I was wasting time. I remember him walking through the office while I was rebuilding the inventory database and joking that computers were just expensive typewriters. I laughed along because that was easier than arguing. Over the next several years, I replaced the spreadsheets with a proper inventory management system, connected purchasing to sales, automated invoice processing, added barcode scanning, built dashboards for cash flow and receivables, and eventually created a system that gave us a daily picture of what we had in stock, what was committed to customers, what had been ordered from vendors, and which accounts were overdue. I was not some genius. I learned a lot of it by necessity. I took online courses at night. I hired consultants when I needed them. I made mistakes. I broke things. I fixed them. I spent weekends migrating data because we could not afford to shut down during business hours. What mattered was that after a while, the company became significantly more efficient. Orders that used to take half a day to process could be handled in minutes. Inventory discrepancies dropped. We stopped carrying piles of dead stock because the system could show what was actually moving. Our vendors started giving us better terms because our payment history improved. We stopped missing customer invoices. Most importantly, I created procedures so another employee could understand what was happening without having to call me every 5 minutes. That last part became important later. At the time, I thought I was doing what my family expected. I thought I was helping build something we could all be proud of. I had no idea that my dad had started seeing the changes as proof that I thought I was better than him. The first warning came from something incredibly small. Derek had started showing up late, not occasionally, regularly. He would arrive 40 minutes after everyone else, grab coffee, make a few sales calls, disappear for lunch, and then spend the afternoon talking with my dad. I noticed because sales orders were getting entered late. Customers would place an order in the morning, but the paperwork would not hit our system until the afternoon. That meant purchasing sometimes missed the opportunity to replenish something before the next shipment. It was annoying, but I did not think much of it. I assumed my dad handled personnel issues. One Friday, I noticed a customer had placed a large order, and Derek had manually overridden the payment terms. The account was marked as net 30 when the customer normally had to pay in advance. I brought it up with our controller. She said my dad had approved it. I let it go. There were small things like that for months. My dad would tell me to stop obsessing over reports. Derek would complain that the new software made everything slower. One of our warehouse supervisors would quietly ask me whether we were changing purchasing rules again. I kept explaining that nothing was changing without approval. I thought I was dealing with normal growing pains. Then my grandfather died. That changed the family dynamic almost overnight. My dad had always been much more confident when my grandfather was in the room. After the funeral, he seemed determined to prove that the company was completely his. That was when I started hearing comments about legacy. He talked about how the business had been built by hand. He talked about how his father had worked 6 days a week. He talked about how modern managers did not understand what it meant to actually run a company. I listened because I knew some of it was grief. At the same time, I started getting pulled out of decisions. My access to certain reports was reduced. I noticed purchase approvals were being handled differently. A few system permissions I had created for myself were removed and then restored after I asked why. Nobody gave me a straight answer. I eventually asked my dad directly whether there was a problem with my work. He told me there was no problem. He said I needed to learn that being useful was not the same as being in charge. That comment stuck with me, not because it was insulting, because I realized he thought I was trying to be in charge. I wasn't. I had been trying to keep things organized. I started keeping better records after that, not secret records, just normal business records. I downloaded copies of invoices I had approved. I kept project documentation. I saved process notes. I made sure major changes were documented in email. I started writing down instructions that existed only in my head. I figured it was good management. I did not yet understand that I was building evidence for an argument I would eventually need to have. The real confrontation happened almost a year later. We had a Monday morning leadership meeting. The controller was there. Our operations manager was there. The warehouse manager was there. My dad was at the end of the table. Derek was sitting beside him. I had prepared a report showing that our inventory carrying costs were climbing, our accounts receivable were aging, and several large customers were receiving terms outside their normal agreements. I wanted to tighten controls before things got worse. I had numbers. I had trend lines. I had examples. I had a simple plan. We needed approval thresholds. We needed sales exceptions documented. We needed inventory counts every week instead of every quarter. We needed someone besides me trained to manage our enterprise system. I remember walking into that room thinking the meeting might be uncomfortable but still productive. I was wrong. I had barely finished explaining the receivables problem when my dad leaned back in his chair and smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they think you have misunderstood something fundamental. He looked at the reports and then looked at me. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. He smirked and asked whether I really thought the company ran on computers. I did not know how to answer. He continued explaining that our customers did not care about dashboards, automation, or software. They cared about relationships. He said he had built the company by shaking hands and knowing people's names. Then he told everyone that I had become too dependent on systems. Derek nodded beside him. That was when my dad announced that Derek would be taking over operations, not the whole company. At first, he described it as a temporary restructuring. Derek would become general manager. I would move into a technology support role. I asked what that meant for my access to purchasing, inventory, finance, and vendor information. My dad said I would not need access to most of it anymore. I asked who would maintain the software. He said Derek would handle the business and the technical side could be figured out later. I looked at Derek. He looked almost embarrassed. I genuinely thought he might refuse. He did not. He accepted the role. I asked my dad whether he wanted me to stay. He said he did. Just not in the way I had been working. I could feel everyone waiting for me to argue. I didn't. That probably surprised them more than an outburst would have. I gathered my paperwork. I told the controller I would finish the projects already assigned to me and prepare transition documents. My dad looked almost disappointed. I think he wanted a fight. Instead, I walked back to my office. I spent the afternoon documenting everything. I wrote instructions for purchase orders. I listed vendor contacts. I wrote down how our inventory reconciliation worked. I documented month-end procedures. I created a schedule for system backups. I included every routine task I performed. I did not sabotage anything. I did not delete anything. I did not change passwords. I did not hide information. I transferred everything I was supposed to transfer. I also removed my personal files from company equipment and left all company information exactly where it belonged. A week later, I handed over my keys. My dad barely looked at me. Derek shook my hand. I told him I hoped it worked out. I meant it. That was the strange part. I was hurt. I was embarrassed. I was furious. But I still wanted the company to survive. It was my family's business. It had my grandfather's name on the old wall photographs. I had spent most of my adult life there. Walking away did not feel like winning. It felt like leaving a house after a fight and realizing you had no idea whether you would ever be invited back. For the first few weeks, I checked my phone constantly. I expected my dad to call. He didn't. Derek sent me 2 messages asking about routine software issues. I answered both. Then he stopped asking. I started a job search. A former vendor I had worked with offered me a position doing operations consulting for several small businesses. The pay was slightly better than what I had been making. The benefits were better. The work was less personal. I accepted. For the first time in years, I went home at 5:30. I grocery shopped on the way home. I cooked dinner. I had weekends. It was strange. I did not realize how much of my life had been consumed by fixing things nobody else even knew were broken. 3 weeks into the new job, our former controller called me. She asked whether I still had a copy of the month-end close checklist. I told her I had my personal notes, but everything company-related had been left on the shared drive. She said she could not find the current version. I was confused. I searched the old email thread from when I had created it. I forwarded it to her. She thanked me. Then there was a pause. She asked if I had spoken to my dad. I said no. She said things were a little chaotic. I asked whether they needed help. She said she did not want to get involved. A few weeks later, she resigned. I found out through an automatic email response. That was the first moment I became genuinely worried, not because one employee had left. People leave. I was worried because she had been the only person besides me who understood the monthly financial process from beginning to end. I called her after work. She explained that Derek was changing purchasing rules without checking cash flow. She said my dad was approving exceptions. She also said several long-term employees were frustrated because Derek kept telling them that the old system was too complicated. I asked why they were changing it. She said Derek wanted things done his way. I asked what his way was. She laughed, but it was not a happy laugh. Apparently, his way involved using spreadsheets again. That sounded ridiculous. I assumed she was exaggerating. I had already left. I did not want to become the bitter former employee who believed the company could not survive without him, so I told myself they would figure it out. Then I heard about the first major problem. A large customer had not received a shipment because inventory had been allocated incorrectly. It turned out the company had physically had the product. The system had shown the product available, but somebody had manually overridden the allocation. Nobody knew why. Derek blamed the warehouse. The warehouse manager blamed purchasing. Purchasing blamed sales. My dad blamed the new software rules. The customer simply switched suppliers for that order. It was not catastrophic, but it was avoidable. I heard about it from a former coworker. I thanked him for telling me and moved on. A month later, another customer complained about duplicate invoices. Then a vendor put us on credit hold. That one caught my attention. Our business had been built on good vendor relationships. Being placed on credit hold was not normal. I asked my former coworker what happened. He said a payment had been made late. I assumed it was a one-time accounting issue. Then I started hearing that invoices were being delayed. At my new job, one of the clients had a business account with the same bank we used. I happened to be there for a meeting when someone mentioned a bounced payment from an unrelated company. I did not think anything of it. But that night, I checked my old email archive. I found copies of several notices from our vendors. The dates were concerning. Payments had started stretching beyond normal terms almost immediately after I left. I still did not know what was really happening. I just knew the pattern had changed. Then Derek called me. It was after 9 at night. I almost did not answer. When I did, he sounded exhausted. He asked whether I had left the inventory server configured a certain way. I told him I had transferred all the documentation. He said something had been changed. I asked by whom. He said he did not know. I asked whether he had checked the changelog. He said he did not know where to look. That surprised me. I had trained 3 different employees on the changelog. I explained where it was. He found it. The changes had been made manually by an administrator account. It was not mine. He said he would call back. He never did. The next morning, I received an email from my dad saying I was interfering with the company after leaving. I stared at it for a long time. I had not accessed anything. I had not called anyone. I had not touched their system. I forwarded the email to my lawyer. I did not have a lawyer because I expected a lawsuit. I had one because a former employer had once made the mistake of threatening me without having their paperwork in order. This time, I wanted someone to review the situation before I reacted. My lawyer told me not to argue. He told me to keep copies of everything. He told me not to access company systems without authorization. He also told me that if I had documentation showing my work had been transferred properly, I should preserve it. So I did. That was the point where this stopped being a family disagreement and became a business matter. I hated that. I wanted my dad to call and tell me he had made a mistake. Instead, he sent another email accusing me of abandoning the company. I replied once. I stated that I had completed the transition requested of me, returned company property, transferred documentation, and had not accessed company systems since leaving. I did not insult anyone. I did not mention Derek. I did not mention the mistakes. Then I stopped responding. 2 months later, I learned the company had missed payroll, not by a week, just by 2 days, but for employees who depend on direct deposit, 2 days can feel like forever. A former warehouse worker called me. He said the office was panicking. I asked whether the issue had been fixed. He said yes. Then he told me something else. The company had taken out a short-term loan. I asked why. He said Derek had said it was for expansion. That made no sense. The company was not expanding. Orders were down. Receivables were aging. Vendor terms were tightening. I called my lawyer again. He said there was nothing for me to do unless I had a legal interest in the business. I didn't. That was the hardest part. I could see the train coming. I could not legally stop it. For years, I had been the person who spotted problems early enough to fix them. Now I was just watching. Then Thanksgiving came. My family still gathered at my parents' house. I almost didn't go. My mother called me repeatedly until I agreed. I told myself I could handle a few hours. Derek was there. My dad acted completely normal. He asked about my new job. He asked whether I liked it. I said yes. Derek spent most of dinner talking about how busy the company was. He described a major new account. He talked about hiring. He talked about equipment. I noticed my mother looked uncomfortable whenever he mentioned money. At one point, Derek said something about a new line of credit. My dad looked at him sharply. Derek changed the subject. I did not say anything. On the drive home, I realized I had been holding my breath. The next morning, my mother called. She told me not to get involved. That sentence bothered me more than anything else. I asked what she thought I was getting involved in. She said my dad believed I was trying to prove that he had made a mistake. I told her I was not trying to prove anything. She said she believed me. Then she asked whether I still had copies of the old records. I said yes. She did not ask for them. A week later, she called again. She told me my dad had been at the bank. I asked why. She said he was trying to restructure the company's debt. That was the first time anyone had admitted the company was in serious trouble. From there, things accelerated. A vendor filed a demand for payment. Another reduced our credit line. A customer sued after a large equipment order was delayed for weeks and then partially canceled. The warehouse manager resigned. 2 drivers quit. The accounts receivable clerk left. Every departure created another gap. I heard that Derek was personally calling customers. He was trying to reassure them. Apparently, he promised delivery dates that operations could not meet. That made the problems worse. The company had entered a cycle. Orders were delayed because purchasing was behind. Purchasing was behind because vendors were demanding payment. Vendors demanded payment because cash was tight. Cash was tight because receivables were aging. Receivables were aging because invoices were going out late. Invoices were going out late because the people who understood the process were gone, and the process had been built around systems Derek had dismissed as unnecessary. I did not feel vindicated. I felt sick. I started having trouble sleeping. I would wake up and think about all the people who worked there. Some had been with the company longer than I had. They had mortgages, car payments, children, medical bills. They had nothing to do with my dad's decision. I started wondering whether I should have stayed. That question bothered me for months. Maybe I had been too rigid. Maybe I should have swallowed my pride. Maybe I should have gone back and offered help. Then I remembered the meeting. My dad had not asked me to stay and help. He had removed me from the job. He had handed the operational role to Derek. And when I left, I had transferred everything I had. I had done what I was told. By January, the company was openly struggling. Employees started posting vague comments online about delayed pay. A customer sent a formal notice that their contract was being terminated. The company's insurance carrier requested additional documentation after a claim involving damaged equipment. The paperwork was incomplete. The office staff could not find the original records. I was contacted by the attorney handling the claim. I was not representing the company. He wanted to know whether I had created the original documentation system. I confirmed that I had. He asked whether I could explain what records normally existed. I could. I provided the information through my lawyer. That was all. A month later, my dad's attorney contacted me. The message was complicated. The company was preparing for a restructuring. They wanted copies of historical procedures and documentation. I provided what I had. There was no satisfaction in it. It felt like helping someone who had pushed you out only to realize later that you were the person who knew where the light switches were. By March, the company had stopped paying several vendors altogether. A creditor filed a lawsuit. The bank began requiring additional oversight. Employees were being asked to reduce hours. Derek stopped answering messages from former coworkers. My dad finally called me. It was the first direct conversation we had had in months. He did not apologize. He did not admit he had been wrong. He said the business was under tremendous pressure and asked whether I would come back temporarily. I asked what role he wanted me to have. He said he wanted me to stabilize operations. I asked whether I would have authority over purchasing, inventory, finance systems, and the people responsible for those areas. He said we could discuss it. I told him I would need everything in writing. There was silence. Then he said he thought families should be able to trust each other. I told him trust was exactly why I wanted it in writing. He did not like that. The conversation ended shortly afterward. I felt guilty for refusing. For a few days, I almost changed my mind. Then my lawyer reminded me of something simple. If I went back into a collapsing company without clear authority, I could become responsible for decisions I did not make. That was not being disloyal. That was being careful. I stayed out. 2 weeks later, Derek resigned. That was when the company lost its last person who could plausibly keep the day-to-day operation moving. I learned the details from my former coworker. Derek had apparently discovered that several major vendor accounts were past due. He had also discovered that some customer contracts were being renewed without the approvals required under the company's internal procedures. He told my dad he could not keep signing off on decisions he did not understand. My dad accused him of abandoning the family. Derek quit anyway. For the first time, I started wondering whether Derek had ever actually wanted the job. Maybe he had wanted the title. Maybe he had wanted my dad's approval. Maybe he had believed he could run the company because selling was what he knew. I did not know. I still don't. What I do know is that he had been put into a position he was not prepared to manage. And I do not think he understood that until it was too late. After Derek left, my dad tried to run everything himself. That lasted less than a month. A business that had once processed hundreds of orders every week was now relying on people who were making decisions without a complete view of inventory, cash, or vendor commitments. The company began returning payments. Checks were bounced. A delivery van was repossessed after missed payments. A landlord filed a demand for unpaid rent. The bank froze additional borrowing. One morning, the employees arrived to find the warehouse locked. The company had not paid the building's security contractor. That was the final warning sign. By then, there was no realistic way to fix the business without restructuring its debt. The bankruptcy filing came a few weeks later. I found out from a public notice. I sat at my kitchen table and read the filing 3 times. It was strange seeing the company described as a legal entity, instead of as the place where my grandfather had once swept the floors. There were pages of liabilities, vendor balances, equipment loans, tax obligations, lease obligations, credit lines, accounts payable. I recognized names. I recognized customers. I recognized vendors my grandfather had done business with for decades. The numbers were worse than I had expected. I realized then that the collapse had not happened because one person quit. The company had been declining for months. My leaving had simply removed the system that had been hiding how fragile things had become. The bankruptcy attorney contacted me because some of my old procedures were referenced in the records. I answered questions. I provided copies of transition documents. The records showed that the system had been operational when I left. There were documented procedures. There were documented approvals. There were documented handoff notes. There was an email confirming that I had completed the transition. There were timestamps. There were backup reports. There was nothing dramatic. That was the funny part. The truth was boring. It was just paperwork. My dad had spent months implying that I had walked away irresponsibly. The documents showed that I had done exactly what I was asked to do. The bankruptcy process took months. There were meetings with creditors. Assets were evaluated. Equipment was sold. The warehouse lease ended. Some employees found jobs elsewhere. Some struggled. I helped one former coworker update his resume. I referred another person to my new employer when we had an opening. I never spoke badly about my dad to them. I did not want their careers tied to our family conflict. My mother struggled the most. She had always believed the company would somehow recover. She had built her retirement assumptions around the business continuing to exist. Now she was facing a completely different future. My dad became quieter. He stopped attending family gatherings for a while. When he did show up, he seemed exhausted. The anger was gone. That was almost harder to see. For years, I had thought my dad wanted to dominate every conversation. After the bankruptcy, I realized some of that behavior had probably come from fear. He had spent his whole adult life defining himself through that company. Once it was gone, there was not much left for him to hide behind. I still did not excuse what he had done. Understanding something is not the same as forgiving it. Months later, he finally asked to meet. We went to a diner near my office. It was the first time we had been alone together since the meeting where he put Derek in charge. He looked older, not dramatically, just tired. He told me he thought he had been protecting the company from becoming too dependent on me. I asked him why. He said he had started believing that everyone deferred to me. He felt like employees listened to me more than they listened to him. I did not know that. I told him I had never wanted his position. He said he knew that now. I asked why he had not asked me. He said he was embarrassed. That answer hurt more than I expected. He admitted he had been afraid that if he let me become the person who understood everything, he would eventually become irrelevant. I asked whether he understood what happened after I left. He said yes. He said the company had been functioning because I had built systems around the parts of the business nobody wanted to think about. He told me he had mistaken visible work for valuable work. He had seen me sitting at a computer and thought I was avoiding the real business. He had not understood that the computer was where I was keeping track of the real business. That was the closest thing I ever got to an apology. I accepted it. I did not promise anything. I did not tell him everything was okay. It wasn't. Some things cannot be undone. The company was gone. My grandfather's business was gone. People lost jobs. Vendors lost money. My mother's financial plans changed. My dad lost the company he had spent decades building, and I lost the version of my relationship with him where I believed hard work automatically earned respect. That took me a long time to accept. The most difficult part was realizing I still loved him. I wanted him to succeed. I wanted him to have been right. I wanted the business to survive so badly that there was a part of me that wished I could have been the one to prevent all of it. But I eventually understood that wanting to save something does not mean you are responsible for saving it after someone deliberately removes your ability to do so. The company did not fail because I left. It failed because the controls, relationships, processes, cash discipline, and institutional knowledge were dismissed until the business could no longer function without them. I had simply been the person holding those pieces together. When I walked away, nobody noticed how much was being held. That was the lesson I carried into my new job. I became much more deliberate about documentation. I trained other people. I made sure no single employee was the only person who understood a critical system. I created backup procedures. I encouraged companies to cross-train. I stopped assuming that competence would automatically be recognized, and I stopped taking it personally when someone did not understand the value of work happening quietly in the background. A year after the bankruptcy, my dad started working part-time as a consultant for a small contractor. It was not glamorous. He was not running a company. He was helping people manage purchasing and vendor relationships. I actually thought it suited him. He was very good at talking to customers. He understood people. He had always understood people. What he had struggled with was accepting that modern businesses needed both relationships and systems. Derek moved away from sales management and took a job with another distributor. I heard through my mother that he had admitted he had been in over his head. I never asked him whether he blamed me. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. I stopped caring, not because I hated him, because there was nothing left to solve. The family relationship changed slowly. My dad and I started having lunch every few weeks. Some conversations were uncomfortable. Sometimes he tried to minimize what happened. Sometimes I reminded him of specific things that had hurt me. We did not pretend everything was fixed. That made the relationship better. There was less pretending. My mother eventually sold the house they had been planning to keep through retirement. They downsized. The move was emotional. I helped pack boxes one Saturday. I found an old binder with photographs from the earliest years of the business. There was my grandfather standing outside the original shop. My dad was beside him. He looked about 20 years old. They were both covered in grease. They were smiling. I sat on the floor holding that photograph longer than I expected. I realized I had spent so much time thinking about how my dad betrayed me that I had forgotten he was also grieving the loss of something he genuinely loved. That did not erase what he did, but it helped me understand why he had been so afraid of losing control. The company had represented his identity. He thought handing control to me meant admitting he was no longer the person who built it. So he chose someone who would make him feel like the old version of himself. He chose Derek. The consequences were real. The bankruptcy was real. The employees losing jobs was real. None of those things were deserved, but I also stopped telling myself that I should have stayed just to prevent it. I had given everything I had to that company. When I was asked to leave, I left professionally. I documented my work. I preserved records. I answered reasonable questions. I did not sabotage anything. I did not send angry messages. I did not leak private information. I did not try to embarrass my dad. I simply stopped carrying responsibility that no longer belonged to me. That was probably the hardest thing I had ever done. Not walking away from a job. Walking away from the belief that I had to keep proving my worth to people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. Looking back, I can see warning signs I ignored. I ignored Derek's unexplained schedule changes. I ignored unusual payment terms. I ignored how often my dad questioned the systems I built without asking whether the systems were actually working. I ignored the little moments when employees would come to me because they were afraid to bring problems to management. I told myself it was normal family business tension. Maybe some of it was, but I also think I had spent so long solving problems that I stopped asking whether the people around me actually wanted the problems solved. That was my mistake. My dad's mistake was different. He confused control with understanding. He thought being the person with the final authority meant he could ignore the systems underneath him. The bankruptcy taught him otherwise. The lesson was expensive for everyone. I still think about that Monday morning meeting sometimes. My dad smirking, the report on the table, the sense that I was being childish for caring about numbers. I remember the moment he handed control to Derek. I remember wanting to argue. I remember choosing not to. At the time, I thought walking away quietly meant I had lost. Now I see it differently. I did not walk away because I had no answer. I walked away because I knew exactly what I had built, exactly what I had transferred, and exactly what I was responsible for. I did not need to convince anyone in that room. The records would speak for themselves, and eventually they did. The final bankruptcy paperwork listed hundreds of pages of debts and claims. Some of them were unavoidable business losses. Some came from decisions made after I left. Some had been developing before I left, but there was no mysterious missing piece. There was no dramatic conspiracy. There was no secret villain. It was just a business that slowly stopped doing basic things correctly while the people in charge kept insisting those basic things did not matter. The computers were never what kept the company alive. I understand that part now. The company was kept alive by the boring stuff: accurate records, proper inventory counts, vendor payments, credit controls, customer follow-up, employee training, documentation, cash forecasting, knowing when a number looked wrong, knowing which number mattered, and knowing that a business can look busy right up until the moment it runs out of money. My dad once thought that sitting in front of a computer meant I was avoiding the real work. What he never understood was that I was doing the real work before he could see it. By the time problems became visible to everyone else, they were already months old. That is what I wish I had understood sooner. Not about computers, about people. Some people do not value what keeps a thing running until the thing stops running. When I finally walked away, I did not take anything with me except my personal belongings and the knowledge I had spent years building. The company still had the software. The files were still there. The procedures were still there. The equipment was still there. The customer list was still there. What changed was who was paying attention. And once nobody was paying attention, the cracks that had been small enough to fix became too large to ignore. I have not worked for a family business since. I probably never will. My relationship with my dad is better than it was immediately after the bankruptcy, but it is also more honest. There are boundaries now. We do not mix money and family. We do not make decisions based on pride. And when something important needs to be decided, we write it down. He jokes about that sometimes. I think he knows exactly why I insist on it. As for me, I am doing well. I have a job I like. I make good money. I have weekends. I have savings. I do not wake up at 2 in the morning wondering whether an unpaid vendor invoice got entered correctly. And I no longer feel guilty for that. I used to think loyalty meant staying until the end. Now I think loyalty also means knowing when you have done everything you reasonably can. The company my grandfather built is gone. That still hurts. But the part of me that spent years believing I had to hold everything together is gone too. And honestly, losing that part of myself was probably the one thing I gained from the whole mess. My dad thought I walked away because I was too dependent on computers to understand the real business. What he learned, far too late, was that the business had been depending on someone who understood what happened when the computers, paperwork, people, money, and procedures all had to work together. That person was me. And once I finally stopped doing the job nobody appreciated, everyone found out exactly how much of the company had been running, because I was quietly keeping it alive.